Nackträning som förebyggande åtgärd mot idrottsrelaterade hjärnskakningar. Funkar det egentligen? Det ska den här gästen i dagens avsnitt få lov att berätta mer om. Det är forskaren från Lund vid namn Branimir Ivanic. Och när jag kontaktade Branimir så kände inte jag honom sedan tidigare. Jag hade bara läst hans forskningsartiklar innan det här mötet. Men då svarade han att han jättegärna är med i podden, men intervjun måste ske på engelska. Så hela intervjun är på engelska och det kommer djupdykas väldigt mycket kring just Branimirs forskning på hjärnskakningar. Och som ni också kommer få höra så var det ganska mycket som jag blev förvånad över, som jag inte riktigt hade förväntat mig att han skulle svara. Så en super spännande intervju som jag hade med Branimir, och hoppas ni tycker det är lika intressant. Vi ska inte dröja längre. Jag släpper på intervjun med hjärnskakningsforskaren Branimir Ivanic. Välkomna till Hjärnskakningspodden. Här diskuterar vi allt som har att göra med just hjärnskakningar. Jag delar med mig av konkret information, erfarenheter och intervjuer som gör det enkelt att få reda på mer om det här ämnet. Mitt namn är Viktor Bull. Jag är legitimerad fysioterapeut med särskilt intresse för just hjärnskakningar. Kom ihåg att innehållet i den här podden inte ersätter bedömning av legitimerad sjukvårdspersonal. Branimir, you are a PhD student at Lund University with a research focus on prevention of sport-related concussion, you write on your LinkedIn profile. And very recently you were the main author of a study called Efficacy of Exercise Intervention on Prevention of Sport-Related Concussion and Related Outcomes, a systematic review and meta-analysis. And I just would like to ask you, where did your research career start? And why would you like to go into the field of, in your case, concussion research?
First, thank you, Victor, for inviting me on this podcast. I think it's really, really cool that you as a clinician are interested in this topic, and that we from the academic side can shed some light, and then you can take that light and apply it in your clinic. Well, the concussion research for me was never really planned. My background is in kinesiology, and I also have a degree in physical therapy. So I was always looking for a sports medicine approach to injuries. I always wanted to work with athletes, and I just couldn't really figure out where does these two fields of concussion or of kinesiology and of physical therapy, where can I combine them? Where can I implement all the knowledge that I got from those two separate fields? And then I was offered by now my supervisor, Professor Eva Agaberg, to do a small summer research project. And she offered me exactly this, the research in sports-related concussion, which I knew nothing about. I had no idea about it. I had limited amount of knowledge from my university days as a student, and I was quite interested in taking on a topic that I have no idea what the research is in the field. So I took that up and I started doing my summer research. At that point, we only did a small scoping review just to see what is out there. Is there anything of relevance when we talk about exercise interventions for prevention of concussion? And I think that small scoping review was a really good success for me and for both of us. And we just kept on working on this topic. I continued working with Eva on my master thesis, where we then performed a systematic review on this same topic. And then I also did an additional summer research school one more time with her, where I actually developed a program based on the previous research. So it started very slowly, but then, as I kept getting more and more into the field, I started falling in love with the field, because I really find it super fascinating. In the beginning was maybe less so because I didn't know this research. I didn't know what was happening. But again, after doing a scoping and then doing a systematic and then doing an additional small research study, I was offered a PhD position, and I was like, okay, this is it now. This is going to be my upcoming. I'm gonna do PhD in 3 years. So I said, okay, this is going to be my upcoming 3 years. Let's dive really, really deep, and let's open this PhD with the best systematic review I could possibly produce, and try to get as much as we can covered and see and really get introduced to this topic in a very systematic way. And that's going to now set us up for the upcoming studies in my PhD program. So again, but to make this story very short, pure accident and again, brilliancy from the side of my supervisor now, Eva Agerberg, who wanted to discuss and wanted to explore this topic.
Do you have any personal experience from concussion, like when you were younger or playing sports or anything like that?
Yeah, I played basketball for quite a while when I was a teenager, and I received some bad ones, couple of elbows to the head, but that was back not that far ago, but long ago. But it's been, I would say, maybe 15 years. So the understanding of concussion 15 years ago and reporting of concussion was very, very low at that point. So I would not say that I had any really systematic approach from both my coaches or medical staff into how to deal with this, what I'm experiencing. So I always knew that it was a topic worth exploring as soon as I was offered doing it. It's just that the amount of information that one student gets during his or her education, being it in kinesiology or biomechanics or in physical therapy, is quite limited. So again, it's a very daunting task to start researching something that you experienced yourself, but you really don't know nothing about, and no one really around you knows much about it either.
But going into this field, not knowing that much to begin with, what was the most fascinating or interesting part to you when researching or reading more about sport-related concussions?
One thing I can say, starting as a clean slate, tabula rasa, right? You have no idea what is out there. I overall, I would call that a blessing rather than a curse, because you really keep your eyes open for everything. So I know for a fact that if the amount of time right now I spend on biomechanical studies is a fraction of the amount of time I used to spend when I just was researching the field. So the head acceleration data and the risk of concussion connected to the head acceleration and post-concussive impacts and all the other ones. I mean, that's all, again, that's all something that you explore when you're new at that. But then as you become more and more specialized into something, your research view closes in a little bit. I think it's inevitable because you really need to know you need to really know good the literature that you are in and that you are researching, and then everything else falls a bit on a wayside. So I would say it again, it's really a blessing to be new in the field and just say, okay, let me learn everything about it. So from epidemiological side to biomechanical side to exercise interventions, which I was very interested in, to symptoms, to you just open up and say, okay, let me get the most amount of information I can get and let me see what I can do with it. So that's pretty much how I did it.
Seeing that it's a very broad field, it's one diagnosis, but it can mean so many things, and it's a very, very complex topic once you start looking into it.
I agree. It is, and again, if we step away from the prevention, if you're talking about the treatment of an athlete, which I guess you would know better than I do as a clinician yourself. Treating an athlete with a concussive injury, it's quite difficult. Not only treating physiological signs, but also treating all the emotional and psychological aspects. I think that can be very, very demanding, and maybe one of the reasons why why we maybe still don't understand as much as we should, because it's such a multi-dimensional complexity to the concussion injury. So I would agree with you that complexity makes it a bit less clear in the way forward for all of us, and in the treatment of it, but also in the prevention, primary prevention, which I'm focusing on.
Mm. And in your focus area, you wrote a systematic review and where you looked at exercise intervention as a prevention of sport-related concussions. And I just want to know, firstly, okay, you wrote a systematic review. What is that?
Okay, so the simplest answer, I would say, is that systematic review is a method of doing research where you are collecting all the relevant research, individual, original research out there, and you're aggregating it into one spot and seeing what is the overall effect across all studies. One would consider systematic reviews to be the highest level of evidence in research. For a lot of guidance and consensus statements, we are looking into systematic reviews. And of course, we know that having one study proving or disproving something is not enough. And that's where the value of systematic research or systematic review comes from, picking apart a large number of studies, hopefully a large number if you have a large number that you can take in, but picking them apart and seeing what is the quality of these studies and what is the overall effect of a particular intervention, and then extrapolating from that data as much as you can to actually help you change something in the real world. And I would say, if you're new into any type of a research field, starting off by producing, it doesn't have to be a systematic review. It can be a scoping or it can be a narrative review, to see what is out there, to see what research has already been done. I think it's a great way to get introduced to the topic that you were embarking upon.
So what you and your colleagues has done is that you take a lot of studies that has been written before, and then from all of those studies, you try to come to a conclusion of what is correct and what is not correct. Is that how you should see a systematic review?
That's exactly it. So, like you open it up with your aim. You wanted to look into a specific population. In this case, it was athletes. You want to look into a specific intervention. In this case, for us, it was exercise interventions. And then we wanted to see how particular intervention affects this, and this outcome for this population group. So that's exactly what we did also. And we wanted to look into, again, as I said, the efficacy of exercise interventions on not only sports-related concussion, because we knew, starting this systematic review, as I did my master thesis on this, we knew that there was not a lot out there, and one should always be careful calling something a systematic review if you have only one or two studies. I think scoping would be a better option for you, a little bit less time and energy taking. But we also wanted to add, alongside sports-related concussion, we also wanted to add linear and rotational head acceleration, which are one can consider primary kinematic parameters, and also a potential intrinsic modifiable factor for SRC injury, which is the neck muscle strength. So we looked into the efficacy of exercise interventions on all these outcomes.
And we're going to get in a little while into the results of this systematic review. But you also wrote in the title that this was a systematic review and a meta-analysis. And you see that in some studies. Not all. It says this is a systematic review, but sometimes you read, as in your study, it's a meta-analysis. And number one, what does that mean? And is it good? Is it bad? What takes to call it a meta-analysis as well?
Mm-hmm. So not every systematic review needs to have or has meta-analysis within it. That really, really depends on the number of studies that you gather, on the similarity of those studies. And if you deem that the studies are similar enough and you deem that you have enough studies to perform such an analysis, then you perform, as you call it, meta-analysis, which is a statistical analysis where you put all the effect sizes of every individual study, you perform a statistical analysis on that, and then you get as an output an effect size, which is an overall effect size. So in this case, an overall effect size of exercise interventions on these particular outcomes. And then all of that is very neatly presented in a graph, which we call a forest plot, where you can see how every and individual study is contributing to the overall effect size from each for this particular outcome that we are measuring. So again, not every systematic review is going to have it, but if you do have it, you should definitely, if you have the ability to produce it, it's going to provide you this valuable output of data that it's going to maybe guide certain things down the line in a real world implementation, let's say.
Beforehand, when you started writing it, did you know that you were gonna do a meta-analysis, or was that something that came along?
Well, before starting this one, we pretty much decided from the beginning that if possible, we are going to produce meta-analysis also. And that's something that we stated in our study protocol. As I am sure you know, study protocol you produce before you start with the actual study. So in that study protocol, you can also write whether or not you plan to perform certain analyses depending on the amount of studies. So if we take away meta-analysis, you can also do that for the subgroup analyses. You can do the same thing for the sensitivity analyses. So again, you're showing to the readers in the future that you took this into consideration way before you actually performed whatever type of analysis you perform. And you let them know that the idea was to do this and this and this. However, because we didn't have enough studies, we didn't produce it, or we did have enough studies, so there you are, we have it in our results section.
I can imagine. And when you were writing this, the systematic review and meta-analysis builds on older research. For say you took in research from a number of years. You took in a number of studies that you wrote the systematic review on. And I don't know where I heard it first, but sometimes you hear this citation when it comes to systematic reviews: garbage in, garbage out. When it comes to this, can you just tell us more about how much the quality and quantity of those studies affect the result of the systematic review that you write?
Yeah, I mean, it's everything really. I mean, the garbage in and garbage out. It's a rough statement, but it's a truthful one. It really, really depends on the studies you include, and even if you do have, let's say, studies that are lower in their methodological quality, that does not necessarily mean that you should not include them or that you should completely omit them from your analyses. But it's really, really important that if you notice, and you can notice by applying many tools to it. So every study that you include in your meta-analysis or in your systematic review, you put through a rigorous testing. So you go through the risk of bias assessment to see whether or not there is some systematic fault in the study that met your inclusion criteria. Later on, also, you do something that's called certainty assessment. How certain you are that whatever you observed in your systematic review will be observed in the upcoming studies or in the real world once it's applied. So again, at least from my standpoint, I know that maybe some other researchers would look at this differently. As long as you address the limitations of the studies that you included and you make sure that your interpretation of the results you have are in line with the quality of those studies that you included in your systematic review, you should not, again, this is from my opinion, you should not exclude those studies only because they're methodologically inferior to some other studies. So again, to come back to this, garbage in, garbage out. It depends. It really depends. I think that you have the ability as a researcher who is producing systematic review and meta-analysis to be transparent and to, even though you notice that some studies are methodologically less of robustness or of scientific robustness that we are looking for, you can still get some valuable information and data even from such studies.
And even though you sometimes have to or should be including studies that maybe has a high risk of bias or some other methodological faults, then you always have an opportunity in the systematic review to state that as well, I think. So can you tell us more about that? How do you inform the readers of a systematic review how good studies you actually included?
Yes, so that's a very good point. During the performing of systematic review, you have many steps which you can take to make a clear point about certain findings that you have. So, for example, what we did in our study, we produced a sensitivity analysis where we excluded all the studies that have high risk of bias and only kept the studies with low risk of bias. And that way we wanted to see whether or not there is a big difference in our findings when we include all the studies, when we only include the high quality studies, so studies that we deem to be of high quality. And in that sensitivity analysis, we proved that there is no difference in the effect size when we only keep the high quality studies compared to the low quality studies. For me, that's a very good sign that we should keep all of them in, as we clearly cannot see in the data that we have that the lower methodological quality of these studies are really affecting or skewing the data that we're getting out of it. But again, that's something that you need to think in advance. Whether or not you see that as a problem, that's really up to you as a researcher and the methodology that you're following. But if you do want to check whether or not the quality of the individual studies are affecting your data, you should, again, in your protocol, write down that in your sensitivity analysis, we're going to do this, this, and this, and this, one of which is that we're going to exclude high or low quality studies from the analysis and then compare it to the whole meta-analysis with every study. We reported that, and we reported that in a supplemental file 7, I would say. And again, that's up to a reader to then go to a supplemental file 7, see the effect sizes of only high quality studies, and make his or her decision based on that.
That also makes you a lot more transparent when you can show that there are two ways of looking at it. One where you exclude the low quality studies, and the other where you actually include them to see the different results.
That's true. But also another point that I want to make here is that it's who deems what is high quality and what is low quality, right? So we as researchers are the ones who are deciding whether or not this is a low, some concern, or a high quality study. And then in many cases, you might have a study where me personally, I'm going to deem this study to be of a very low quality because I'm assuming that there's no blinding. The randomization might not be truly random, and I go on and on and on based on the information provided in the paper. But some other researcher, let's say we take you, for example, you might check this same paper and say, okay, maybe not high quality, but definitely not low quality. So again, really, such quality assessments are really depending on the researcher, and that there is no real clear right or wrong here. So again, my idea around this would be include what meets the inclusion criteria, and then you make other steps like sensitivity analysis where you can check whether or not so-called low-quality studies are affecting your data or not.
But I know you as a researcher, you have some tools to guide you in, okay, what categories should you be looking for when you judge if a study is of high, low, or moderate quality. Can you talk a little bit about those types of tools or scales that could be used as a researcher to find out which studies are of which quality?
Yeah, and this is something that you can use even yourself if you wanna check whether or not the study that you picked up, it doesn't have to be a systematic review. It can be just an individual study, and you just want to check out some of these aspects of the study to see whether or not the study is of high quality, as you would say it. So one of the most commonly used tools, especially when you are including randomized control trials, is the risk of bias assessment tool 2 from Cochrane. And that's the tool that we used here. And that's a type of a tool that breaks down every study into multiple aspects. Opening with the randomization process, whether or not the randomization was truly random or was it a quasi-random study design. Even if the randomization was true, did you have some differences in the baseline characteristics of the participants in the intervention group compared to the control group? All these things are affecting the quality of the study. And then as you're going aspect by aspect, another aspect is the deviations from the intended intervention. For example, if a lot of people from the intervention group moved into the control group or vice versa. In many cases, when you don't have a blinding and a person knows that she or he is in the control group, they might want to try a little bit of what's on the other side, right? So that's something that we would not want to happen if you want to have a high quality study, right? So you can go aspect by aspect and decide on every individual aspect, do you have a high quality, high risk of a bias problem here, or do you have a low risk of bias problem here? And then ultimately you come down to a one big grade that you decide whether or not this study is a high risk of bias, some concern for bias, or a low risk of bias. And in most cases, you're not going to have many studies that low risk of bias because that's a methodologically sound study. And when you do perform systematic review, that means that 2 reviewers at minimum need to find this particular study to be of really sound methodological quality, which really rarely happens because you can always find a couple of things that, okay, this might be introducing some kind of a systematic difference between the participants in this study.
I can imagine. And when you and your colleagues, because you didn't write this systematic review on your own, I think you were 4 authors, right?
Yes, on this paper we were 4.
Yeah. How does that work when you are picking out the studies? How do you cooperate, the 4 of you, together?
So it always starts with, obviously, with an opening meeting. Let's introduce ourselves to what we plan on doing. And then we make sure that everyone has clear roles. As a first author, you usually have the most amount of things to do. You need to do essentially all the assessments in many ways, and then also writing the manuscript and all the other things. But every author on the paper knows exactly what they need to do in order to contribute enough to become an author. So in this case, we had an opening meeting and we decided we're going to go, this is our aim of the study. We published it before. This is the aim. This is what we're going to look into. And then we presented our inclusion criteria to all authors. So we're going to include this population, this intervention, this control group, these outcomes are we looking into, and then overall what study designs we are looking into. Once we establish what we are including, then we need to start deciding who's going to do what. So in this case, in every systematic review, you always open with a systematic literature search. So you need to perform a nice, comprehensive literature search that needs to be wide enough to capture all relevant data, but not too wide to get a lot of, again, I'm going to use a harsh word, garbage in, that you really don't need to look into in order for you to see whether or not it meets the inclusion criteria. So not too wide, but not too narrow to miss all the relevant out. So it needs to be a perfectly sized literature search that you can do with the help of a librarian or someone who has a great expertise in literature search. So you develop your search terms and you perform your literature search. You obtain all the data in multiple databases that you searched in. I think we chose 6 databases here that we found are relevant enough to look into. And we thought that these 6 are going to be the ones where all the relevant data is going to be published in. So we performed our literature search. We imported that data into software Confidence. And then in our initial meeting, we decided that me and my other colleague, we're going to be the ones who are going to go through all that identified records. And then we go through those, we have some conflicts, then we have a meeting, then we discuss whether or not they should be included or excluded, then we argue for that reason. And then as we go through that process, we get a bit better picture of how many studies we're going to be including in total. After that, we start with data extraction and on and on and on, slowly but surely, but everything is established in this first meeting where we decide, okay, I'm doing this and this and this, you are doing this and this and this. These 2 people are going to be conflict resolvers if the conflict ever arises. So they're going to be the one casting the final voice. And you go step by step into the process, which usually takes year and a half, maybe even 2, depending on how big the search and the systematic review is.
And just for the listeners to understand how difficult this is, because I talked to one of your author colleagues, Kaisa, and last year she told me how many articles you actually read through to pick them. Just for the listeners to understand that, yes, this systematic review that you, Branimir, that you wrote, it's one study, but just to comprehend, how many articles did you and your colleagues read through, or how many abstract summaries of these articles did you read through to make this systematic review?
Oh yeah, so to give a short answer, it was around 8,000. But I know, it sounds really, really a lot, and it is a lot, really it is. I did perform 3 separate literature searches with small tweaks into each, and all 3 came with a different amount of records identified. And the biggest one was around 15,000. The middle one was the one 8,000, and the smaller one was around 4. And obviously, we needed to have a discussion which one are we choosing. And my heart was leading me towards 15,000, but I also know that that's completely not reasonable. 8,000 is already too much. But we landed on 8,000 records, meaning that we went through the title and abstract of 8,000 records. Luckily, I know you're shaking your head, but so luckily our inclusion criteria was so clean and pure and sharp that once we got through 8,000 records, we ended up only with 40 full text papers, meaning that we only needed to read 40 papers in total. And then out of those 40, we included 26 studies. So that shows you really that our inclusion criteria was spot on, and we did not have a lot of confusion whether or not something should or should not be included. That's not always the case. In many cases, I'm a part of another systematic review going on right now where we ended up with 300 full texts, and that takes 350 full texts, and that takes much longer then, because on top of us, this one I think was around 6,000 abstracts. Now you need to read another 300 full text that takes really, really long time. Because after that, those are the studies included. There is no more going back and forth with it. Once you get your 300 in the full text assessment, you need to go through those, and you need to make sure that every single one is really meeting the inclusion criteria. And that's not even meant to mention, to add a bit more context to this. We also, after we did our systematic review search, we ended up with 8,000 records. But I also went through all the systematic reviews that we identified and in the reference list of all the studies that we included, just to make sure that we did not miss some study that might have been included if we caught it in the systematic literature search. So it's a long time, and there is I've heard one professor who is an expert in systematic review methodology. He says one time he said something like, "If you don't have 2 years, don't even start." And in many cases, I can see why. We were lucky we were able to do this in a year. And it was exactly a year from start to the end. But I can see that some of these big ones, when we are talking about hundreds of included studies, they can take years to finish. So 2 years seems like a realistic time frame for each systematic review.
Because it could take, depending on the article, of course, but it could take around 15 to 30 minutes to read through a systematic review, not understanding everything, of course, but reading through. And it's so much work and so many hours behind it. So it's spectacular actually hearing about it.
Yeah, title abstract really depends. It's like a muscle. If you exercise a muscle, it gets better. When you do the title abstract assessment, if you can put together a couple of days of doing it in a row, you're going to get really, really good at it. But unfortunately, if you step away from it for a couple of days, you lose all. The atrophy is severe. So you lose all of it. So you need to go back into it. So for me personally, I'd like to set up a goal. So for me, I do a 500 studies a day. And that takes me approximately 2 or 3 hours to do in the title abstract. And then, of course, when you go move it into the full text, that can take much, much longer because, again, this is the last step before you make a decision whether or not the study should be included. And preferably in that step, you should not be having a lot of conflicts because the inclusion criteria should be clean enough and sharp enough for all of the authors to understand whether or not the study should be or should not be included.
So what you're saying is that it's only the first 2,000 articles that are the most difficult. Then it gets easier.
Yeah, I would agree with you. Yeah, I agree with you. The first couple thousand, I would say that after that, if you can keep your patience and just keep your cool and just go through them, it's gonna happen. It always happens. It's always a daunting task when you see a large number. The biggest review I was ever part of was the one where we had 12,000, and 12,000, that's 4,000 more than 8, right? So it's quite discouraging when you see this whole mountain in front of you, and it's 12,000 steps to take, and every step takes a couple of maybe 10 seconds, 15 seconds to go quickly through. It's quite daunting. Keep your head down, be patient, and just go study by study, and you end up where you should.
It's nice to hear that it's possible, at least.
It is possible. It is possible, absolutely.
I had one question that I sent to you about some conflicting results the last 3 years. And from what I've found is that there has been, you may correct me, but I found 3 systematic reviews between 2021 and 23 on this same subject that you wrote about, but all 3 came to a conclusion that wasn't the same inclusion always, and they didn't always include the same articles, and they included much fewer articles than you did in your systematic review. These articles by Daly et al., Elliott et al., and Garrett et al. Could you talk us through why is it that we sometimes see conflicting results in so few years when it comes to the same method of systematic review?
Yeah, so I agree with you. All 3 of them are considered to be systematic reviews. I think that the biggest difference between all 3 is in their inclusion criteria. So although you might, if you don't look very closely to what they're actually including, you could ask a question, why are not they including the same studies? And in this case, I could see that there were some slight differences in some of the studies. One of the reviews only included athletes that are 18 and older. Another review included all athletes, regardless of age. So there are a couple of these small differences within them. I would say to give a bit of a context around the prevention of sports-related concussion through exercise, we are mostly looking into, at least right now, we are having this hypothesis about stronger necks and reducing the head acceleration due to stronger necks, and then subsequently reducing the concussive impacts due to stronger necks. That's not a new hypothesis. This hypothesis has been out there for a while now. And as you point out, and these systematic reviews point out, we do have some conflicting evidence. What I would say at this point right now, and again, this is now my field we're talking about, so it's my bread and butter, and I would, of course, wanna believe, and I do believe that next trend is gonna be a big differentiator between concussive impacts today and the ones in the future, hopefully less of those. I do want to say that the data is still conflicting, but it's conflicting to the point where I think that we have enough data that supports the next trend hypotheses that we should be pursuing it more. So not every study that comes out nowadays comes with the conclusion that the next trend, higher next trend, is going to be able to prevent concussive impacts. But we have enough of those that do prove that make me feel more intrigued about the topic and make me want to pursue the answers to this question. So a perfect example would be, out of these 3 systematic reviews that you mentioned, the perfect one would be, let's just make sure that I have it in front of me so I don't misquote something, is the Elliott et al. Study from 2021, where they ultimately included 6 studies, if I'm not mistaken. 2 of them were answering the aim about the relationship between the neck strength and sports-related concussion, while they had 4 that were looking into the neck exercise programs and a reduction in sports-related concussion. And I think that these 4 studies that they presented in their literature search or literature review are exactly the same point that we are trying to make in our systematic review. And that is, out of all 4 studies, they identified that, and these are randomized controlled trials, 2 of those 4 quite big, with multiple thousand participants. So we have Atwood et al. Study and Hislop et al. Study, both of which were included in my own systematic review. Both of these studies were studies on rugby players, and they looked into the efficacy of reactivation or warm-up programs, neuromuscular warm-up programs on SRC incidents, so concussion incidents. And what they found was that athletes that perform these exercises 3 times per week at minimum have 60%, if I'm not mistaken, 60% less chance of getting a concussive impact. That's quite a lot. And both of these studies are arguing that the reason why they saw the reduction in concussive impacts was due to the neck strengthening exercises implemented in the warm-up programs. And so far, these would be the 2 biggest randomized control trials that we have on this topic, but they directly looked into the exercise and its effect on concussion incidence. One thing that I need to add here, to perform a study that looks directly into concussion incidence is quite difficult. Concussion, although very common in certain sports, like in ice hockey, in American football, in rugby, it's still quite rare, meaning that every time you want to look into concussion incidence as an outcome, you need to include at least couple of thousand participants, and you need to follow them for at least a couple of seasons of active play. And that's a huge undertaking, not only time-wise, but financial also. So I assume it would need to come from top down. It would need to come from a certain organization or association. It can be a football one, National Football Association, or a rugby or American football, whichever one, whichever sport you choose to do this research in. So it's very unlikely that we're going to get such big studies in the upcoming year or so in other sports than rugby. But this, for me, is strong enough of reasoning, especially because both of these authors are arguing for the neck strengthening exercises, to be like, there is something here. Why don't we look more into it? And I fully understand the point that you, Victor, are trying to make with this conflicting evidence, and I fully agree with it. I think that we do have a conflicting evidence. But again, I do think that the hypothesis that is out there, which is not a new one, but that it's out there, is still intriguing enough, and we still have enough evidence to look into it and say, okay, let's produce more data on this before we toss out this hypothesis as failure of a hypothesis, or we raise it up as this is the solution. Of course, again, I'm a researcher in the field and I really want this to work, but I also need to understand that everything that we do, we want to do for the good of our athletes. And if there is something better out there that only neck strengthening, for example, as a form of exercise for concussion prevention, then again, we should look into that also. We have one study from Clark et al. This was not a systematic review. This was a experimental study where they implemented vision training in a group of American football players. So they followed the concussion incidents in that particular team for X amount of seasons. I think it was 3. And then they implemented the program during the upcoming 3 seasons. It was purely vision training, and they found significant reduction in concussion incidents. That's, again, only one study, and it needs to be interpreted as such. You cannot treat it as a systematic review. We treat it as a one single study that was not repeated since this one was published. So I am keeping my eye on vision training also. I want to see what is out there from vision training. Can we maybe combine those two? Vision training plus neck strengthening programs. Or maybe as well, we need to look into these neuromuscular warm-up programs. Maybe neuromuscular warm-up programs plus neck strengthening programs are giving us something that neck strengthening programs alone cannot. All these questions that I'm giving you right now is the exact reason why we're doing this, because we do not have answers to these questions. And I know it would be much more fun for me to just say, no, this is going to work for sure. I solved it. But the truth of the matter is, we don't know. We have some traces. We have some clues. We are walking towards those clues. We're trying to explore them, and we're trying to produce more data to really get the idea behind whether or not neck strength can reduce concussive incidence in athletes.
Just two points there. The first one, you said that depending on the inclusion criteria for some of these systematic reviews, it could largely affect which studies actually are included. And right. That also affects the conclusion that is drawn from the systematic review. And secondly, you said that it's very difficult to investigate this because, as you said, if you take a soccer team, the likelihood for there being a concussion during a single game is quite low. You have to follow them for many seasons and control for the intervention. So it's quite rigorous research to actually come up with an answer to this. So if I understand you correctly, from those randomized controlled trials that are out there that you consider are the best so far, you mentioned some of them, you cannot say for certain how good neck strengthening is as a prevention tool, but but we're not at a state where we should stop investigating. It could actually be something there. We just don't know how much it helps. Is that how you should conclude it?
That's exactly the point here. Although, again, as I presented now, these 2 big studies, Atwood et al. And Hislop et al., these are studies that are included. Atwood included 1,355 rugby athletes, while Hislop included 2,452. These are enormous studies, really, really big, with many, many teams in them. They showed some significant reduction in concussion, but we also need to be fair and say this is in male players and this is in rugby. We do not know whether or not such changes would be replicable in female population and in other sports like soccer, American football, or other sports, ice hockey, for example. So again, it's very hard to extrapolate the data from one population group and then try to apply it to all the others. But this is a good start. The Atwood study was from 2018. The Hislop study is 2017. And again, we need to take into consideration these studies take years to produce. So we're not going to get them every year. It's not going to be that easy. But as long as we have these positive trends like we have from these two studies, I think that it's still worth looking into it. Now, I definitely think it's worth looking into it and see whether or not this can be something that we can implement in all sports. Because currently, right now, what I would say that the two primary preventative strategies are going towards equipment, so personal equipment like helmets, headgears, mouth guards, face shields, and to policy and rule change. And we definitely see some great efficacy of such strategies in certain sports. So, for example, I can point out the policy change for disallowing body checking in youth ice hockey really works. According to the data that we have, it's really, really effective. And we do not see any unintended consequences of that down the line. So that's really, really good. But what is the policy change that we can apply in soccer? There is no body checking in soccer. There is heading the ball, right? And we tried with heading the ball, and that really did not pan out to be the good policy change because we saw an increase in sports-related concussion compared to other injuries once there was a heading ban implemented in youth under 13, right? So again, if we talk about the protective equipment, helmets, really questionable with the data we have right now. In some sports, maybe are working, in some sports a little less. I don't think that we have a conclusion on that. I don't think we have a conclusion that helmets are effective in any sport really at this point. Concussion, I'm talking about concussion. I'm not talking about skull fractures and others. But what type of a helmet would work in soccer? What type of a helmet would work in handball? They would not dramatically change the concept of the sport. That's what the problem with such strategies is, right? Something that works in one sport doesn't necessarily work in the other. But we do all have necks, right? We all have necks. So regardless of what sport you play, we can work on our intrinsic factor, which in this case would be neck strength. And it's this that I'm hoping that can make a change, that if we do establish, so we can look here and we can say in rugby, in male rugby, that evidence shows right now that neuromuscular warm-up programs, isometric neck strengthening exercises included within them, so the static ones where you're just pushing the head, really works if you implement it regularly. So at least 3 times per week, we're going to see a substantial decrease in concussive impacts. That's very good. I think that's a win for us, and we need to take it and then carry it somewhere else now. And hopefully develop the programs further to be more sport-specific for other sports, to be more population-specific. Maybe female athletes need something different than male athletes. We know that the females are more at risk for concussive impacts. They have more severe concussive impacts, and they take longer to recover from their concussive impacts. So how about we take whatever we have right now and try to pour it into a female sports and try to pour into various types of sports too. So again, long story short here, trying to sum up, would be that we have inconclusive evidence, but evidence nonetheless that should keep us on our toes and sprinting towards this still. And I think that as long as we have people who are willing to do that, we're gonna at one point decide, or we're gonna come up to the body of evidence where we're gonna be more sure whether or not this is the way to go. The last point is, I don't think that it's gonna hurt. That's for sure. I think they can only help, I would say.
That's always the answer when you give to parents when they ask if they should do some neck exercises, that maybe we don't know how much it helps, if it helps you or not, but it's not harmful, at least.
That's okay. Let's talk about that for a second. If appropriately applied, and if followed by very established exercise prescription recommendations, and if the choices of exercises are proper, so no more neck bridges, like what our athletes used to do back in the day, especially boxers, wrestlers. If we avoid such high-risk exercises and we maintain those that are age-appropriate and, to be quite frank, sports-appropriate too, no one really needs to do head head bridges, especially if you're a soccer athlete, right? So if our choice of exercise is appropriate, then we could confidently say cannot hurt. But if we go a little bit crazy, then of course every exercise could be dangerous also.
I just realized how many hundreds of people I told that it's okay to do neck exercises. It's at least not harmful, but now I realize maybe it is in some cases.
Victor, if they Google neck exercises Mike Tyson, and the first thing that would pop is going to be a neck bridge, and they start doing that because they want to have a neck like Mike Tyson, then we might have a problem, Victor, you know?
Yeah, I just realized that.
Yeah.
But if someone comes up to you and asks you, Branimir, does neck strengthening exercises work or doesn't work? What is your answer? What do you usually tell people when they ask you that?
Yeah, that's a very good question.
For a concussion prevention, of course.
Yeah. No, you know. Well, if I was approached and asked the same question, which is funnily enough, not a lot of people do, but let's imagine that they do. I don't have hundreds of people who came to me and asked me because I guess people assume that this is my research field, so they assume that they know the answer. I would say that again, we have enough evidence to show that at least, again, if appropriately applied, it's not going to hurt. We could also take this into the neck injuries and not only focus on concussive injuries, but even if we stay only in the field of concussion, having stronger neck, having more reactive neck musculature, inevitably, I would say, is going to be beneficial. Now, how much? That's a different story. There are definitely impacts that I believe we are not gonna be able to prevent ever. If we have a very strong body to head impact, and if the person is 150 kilos in a full sprint, and you receive that force into your head, I don't think that's preventable, whatever we do. But I think that there is a big gray zone where there are such impacts that are preventable if we have stronger neck musculature. So falling on the ground, let's say, on its own, just falling and your body falling on the ground is not going to cause you concussive impact unless your neck musculature is not strong enough to maintain the head above the floor or above the ground. If the neck musculature is weaker and you get a whiplash injury, but on top of that, you also hit your head on the ground, that's going to definitely cause a concussive impact or concussive injury. So I don't think we can ever be able to prevent all of them. But again, as I said before, I think that there is a gray zone where a lot of prevention that we are focusing on could happen with stronger necks. And that's the ones that we are focusing on. Not to mention also that in, let's say, sports like soccer, football, in female soccer, a lot of concussion comes from heading the ball. I'm convinced that type of a concussive impacts could be prevented with stronger necks, especially when we compare that to their male counterparts who tend to have stronger necks than females. It's very unlikely that a male soccer player is going to experience concussive impact from heading the ball. But that's something that it's established in female football, female soccer. So that's one example of this gray area that I'm talking about, where I think that if someone comes to me as a soccer player and says, hey, I had a concussive impact before, I was wearing a headgear, it did not work, I was doing this or that, it didn't work, give me an advice, I would definitely say try neck strengthening exercises to make sure that we prevent any concussion, try at least to prevent any concussions in the future happening from you heading the ball. We can also take all of this now into a bit more complex area, which is the subconcussive impacts and the short and long-term effects of subconcussive impacts, which, again, we are seeing more and more of that data coming out, showing that even the subconcussive impacts could be quite devastating to an athlete. So, again, I would always recommend it, but that's my field, so it would be a little bit disingenuous not to say that I'm a little bit subjective here, and I do believe in this thing. But again, objective enough in my papers to say we don't know yet.
This actually surprised me a bit. Before you and I, we haven't met or talked to each other before. I just read your articles, and I work with some of your colleagues. Before this interview, I thought that you would say, well, maybe it helps, but if it helps, we don't know it yet. I would think that you would not rant it, but that you would say, no, there doesn't seem to be that much evidence to support the claim that neck strengthening exercises reduces the number of concussions. That's actually what I've been saying for quite some time. But from the conclusion that you drawn in your article, is there in what direction do you think this go? Oh, okay. I'll rephrase the question. I'll say it like this: is it neck strength that prevents the concussion? For example, if you have a smaller player and a bigger player, the bigger player will always have a stronger neck no matter what the smaller player does? Or is it actually exercising the neck that is causing the potential decrease in concussion risk? Or do you actually have to get a stronger neck to do that? I'm sorry about the rephrasing.
I understand. Yeah. I get it. It's a very good question. It's very hard to give a definitive statement about this. As I said from the beginning, we still don't know so much about it. Is it the maximal strength? Is that maximal strength static, or is it dynamic? Is it the ratio between the flexors or extensors that matters? Is it the rate of force development? How fast can you activate your musculature as the impact is coming? These are all great questions, and I think that we don't have that knowledge yet to differentiate. The best thing you can do is, as you're producing your studies, to take into consideration that all of these things matter and could potentially matter. Again, as I pointed out, maybe the ratio between neck flexors and extensors matter. Maybe the neck musculature and activation of that neck musculature matters more than the overall strength of it. We don't really know. The only thing that we know right now from the data that we have is that certain studies are pointing at isometric neck strength to be a factor in reducing concussive impacts. We can also see that athletes with weaker necks, in this case, female and youth athletes, compared to the male and older athletes, experience higher concussive impacts. So more concussive impacts, they're more severe, and they take longer to recover. We also can see that in studies, again, we are going back to those two big studies where they implemented neck strengthening exercises and looked into SRC incidence. The authors argued that the reduction in the incidence is due to the neck strengthening exercises. So in this case, we are still a little bit like detectives. You're picking up clues and pieces all around. And again, you have this overarching hypothesis, which is that the stronger necks are going to reduce the head acceleration. And then the head acceleration, especially the rotational one, is the one that's causing predominantly concussive impacts, right? So again, we are picking a lot of evidence everywhere around. There is no clear definitive answer to this. But again, I'm going to go back to my initial statement, and that is we have enough to still keep wondering and still keep on producing data on this. Again, I think that we are at the right track. We have two studies, big studies, that showed effectiveness. I think that my answer to this would be like, yeah, let's abandon this. Let's jump this ship. Let's move to something else. I think that we have two strong studies. I think we need more. Whether or not it's the strengthening of the neck muscles or just having stronger muscles, or whether it's the ratio, that's maybe question we should do in our second interview in 10 years. Then we're gonna see.
My life was way easier before we did this interview, where I could just say to people that no, it doesn't matter that much with the neck strengthening. What matters is that your neck is stiff at all, that you actually see the ball coming. But I think that I've changed my opinion a lot the last 15 minutes.
Let's talk for a second about that. I think that's a very good point. The anticipated versus unanticipated impacts, right? That's something that you brought up now, and I think it's very valuable also. So what we definitely see, and we definitely know, that when athletes are seeing that impact coming, they're able to brace themselves for that impact, not only by, if they're not able to remove themselves from the impact, they brace themselves and they plant themselves hard, meaning they also activate the neck musculature. Those athletes experience lower head acceleration post-impact compared to the ones where they don't see the impact coming. That's a very good point towards stronger muscles or activated muscles are able to attenuate the head acceleration. Whether or not that can reduce the concussive impacts, again, we don't know. But this bracing factor, which is, I think, a very important one, is something to consider. And maybe that's something that the study that I mentioned in the beginning, the vision training study, was the one that the efficacy of vision training on concussion incidents, you would probably need to search deep to see the connection. But I would assume that it would be from the ability to recognize the impact coming and you being able to remove yourself or brace yourself for the impact is what makes all the difference whether or not the concussive impact is going to occur. So that's what I argue why they saw such a big drastic change in concussion following the vision training. Their athletes were able to recognize the impact coming, their peripheral view was better, they were able to focus on the impact and they were able to avoid it or brace for it. Again, all of this ties back to stronger neck musculature. If I want to take us back to the mouth guards, so one of the effective personal equipments or individual equipments for concussion is the mouth guards in ice hockey. And the argument again for the mouth guards, it's very hard to find if you just someone who's not in the field and you're thinking, why would mouth guard reduce the concussive impacts? But there is an argument that athletes who wear mouth guards, they bite on it, activating their neck musculature quite a lot. Again, during the bracing, if you bite on the mouth guard, you can inevitably activate your neck musculature. And what we see a reduction in concussive impacts for those athletes in that particular sport. So I'm going back here to tell you these are all small details, small clues everywhere. And you pick them up and everything leads towards this idea of the neck musculature, which, by the way, makes sense even if you're not in the field. Yeah, sure, the neck strength, stronger, reduces head acceleration. That probably is going to reduce the concussive impact. That all makes sense, but we just don't have that evidence yet, at least not now.
I think those last 5 minutes were the best phrasing on this subject I have ever heard. Yeah, it's amazing, and you put it in such a good way that from what we know and don't know, that at least we're not throwing it away. At least we have to keep looking for it because it may, or even possibly, is something to find there.
Absolutely. I think I'm personally quite excited about the field. And I think that we are far away from being ready to chuck anything out. And I think that the exercise components, and everyone agrees with that. I would tell you one of the best systematic reviews on the topic, which was again as well recently published, was the study from Elias and Följ et al., which was one of the 10 systematic reviews that they produced for the conference on the sports-related concussion, which happens every couple of years. They looked into the prevention strategies and modifiable risk factors, and they looked into all prevention strategies, so mainly focusing on protective equipment and on rule change. They also make an argument that these are the creme de la creme of concussion research in the world. Their argumentation is also look into exercise components, look more into those, explore them more and see whether or not we have something there. Because again, from the 2 studies that we have, big ones, we definitely have something to look into and try to continue with this research.
But you said that was the crème de la crème of this area. And they, of course, included not only neck exercising as a prevention tool. So from that, I would like to ask you, on this specific topic in concussion prevention, are your systematic review the best so far? And why or why not?
Okay, so I would say that the systematic review that we produced is more niche towards exercise interventions. So we looked at it from a kinesiological perspective and a physiotherapist perspective. What can you do as a kinesiologist or physiotherapist in order for you to work on the neck musculature, or doesn't even have to be neck exercise components, any exercise component? I would say that the best review in the field that looks overall about the prevention strategies is exactly this one that I said right now with the Eliasson et al. I think that it's the most comprehensive. I think they had a dozen authors on the paper. They included 220 articles. They looked not only into prevention strategies, but also in the modifiable risk factors. It's a huge undertaking. I assume this took years to do. So everyone who wants to look into the overall preventative strategies, this is the paper to go. If you're more interested into the exercise components and can we do with exercise what we want to do for the concussion prevention, then I would also point out that our paper. I think that our paper includes everything that is out there considering exercise interventions, not only in the prevention of concussion, but all these other related outcomes. And if you want to get the most amount of data and try to create your own evidence-based, let's call it exercise training or strength neck strength program, the paper that we produced is going to give you all the evidence and data that you need. And you're going to be able to go through all our supplemental files to see what was implemented, what worked, what didn't work, what type of modality was there, what was the frequency, what was the volume, what was the starting level, what was the progression. Everything you need, you're going to find in the supplemental files, and you can make your own evidence-based decision. But again, to take it back, I think that overall, Eliasson et al. Paper is the one to pay attention to if you want to look into the prevention field in general.
That was a very good and very humble answer to say that your study is probably the best in this field when it only comes to neck exercising. And that makes us very confident to... Of course, you're a little bit biased when it comes to this, but I could agree because it's when it comes to the last years of systematic reviews, from my point of view, it's more broad. It's more you go deeper into this question, and that also makes it more trustworthy once you read it. But when you created this systematic review, when you read the randomized controlled trials included in your paper, what factors do you think were missing from those RCTs to show a more reliable result? I mean, how should those studies been conducted differently from your point of view?
Yeah, that's a great point. And this is, again, now I wanna emphasize what we wanted to do with this review. We didn't only want to see whether or not there is effectiveness. We also wanted to learn what are these modalities, how are they implemented, what are these exercises that they're putting up, and can we then use those and replicate it in our own studies? Ultimately, that is the goal of research, to create you can call it a perfect setting, where everything goes as it's supposed to be. And if you achieve this effectiveness that you're looking for, then disseminate that knowledge for practitioners or for other researchers to replicate what you found. So next to our primary aim, which was to look into the efficacy, we also wanted to look into the reporting completeness. How well are these exercise programs reported? And are they reported well enough for us to be able to replicate it? Because again, if you have a great program, but no one can replicate that program is not worth much then. So our secondary aim was that. And I would say from all the RCTs that we looked into, that would be my biggest critique. I don't think that they did a good job in providing us with information about certain components of their exercise programs. I can give you a couple of examples, which I think for a physical therapist and kinesiologist are absolutely mandatory to know if you want to apply a certain program to your athletes. So baseline levels or starting levels. Every athlete is going to have different capacities and abilities. So the baseline level of neck strength is going to be different for everyone. It's really important whether or not your program is given to all the athletes and you all start with this amount of repetition and this load, or is it tailored towards the athletic needs, right? So if you give everything the same to all of them, some athletes who have stronger necks, they're going to not get this type of an input in their musculature that they need to, while some others are going to get so sore they're not going to be able to move their head for like a week. So, and that was rarely reported, whether or not we had any type of a tailoring in the program. Another one which I would say that is absolutely crucial for continuous improvement in the musculature, hypertrophy and musculature strength would be the progression. Whether or not you had the progression in these 8 to 10 weeks, or did you always do the same exercise, the same number of repetitions with the same load? It's very important to know whether or not this occurred or not, so we can prepare our athletes to do, or our equipment for our athletes to, okay, last week you did with this load, this week we're going to up the load because you're ready for it or not. So progression is really important. And another point that I think it was not actually reported by single study, no study whatsoever reported this, was the motivational strategies. Did you have any strategy regarding motivation in place during the program implementation? Because we know that the motivation is really important to adherence to the program. And it's the thing that gets the athletes come back to these types of programs. So did you have verbal motivation? Did you have some other type of a motivation? So we would want to see this in order for us to know what would be the potential barriers for us if we want to start working with our athletes. What type of a response are we going to get from them? So again, all these things I think would tie down to this one simple answer, and that is the transparency of the exercise program is simply not there. You had some studies that were very well, but I would say majority of the studies were not transparent enough for us to be able to replicate it truly into our own study or to implement it into an exercise program in real world. So my recommendation is, and that's something that we wrote in our systematic review, is the same tool that we use to assess how good the reporting is should be used while reporting the programs. Because that way you're going to definitely be able to pick every single aspect of your program, present it to your researcher. It doesn't have to be reported in the main paper. It can be a supplemental file. So report it in a supplemental file. So if another researcher or a clinical practitioner comes and says, oh, I really like this one, I want more information about it, I want to implement it for my athletes or patients, you can go into that supplemental file, get it, and then start using the program as it was intended in the original study. If you don't provide that, then we are, again, just very much blind and everyone is doing their own thing.
So, for example, if they don't supply enough information on how to perform the exercises, for whom and when, and how to progress, it's very hard to just take the conclusion that, okay, this works or this doesn't work. And if it works, then, well, you cannot use it either way. They wrote that it works, but they don't explain for other people how to do it. And also for other scientists, if a scientist want to replicate their study to see if they come to the same conclusion, they're not able to. Is that how you should?
That's exactly what I'm saying. it's, again, really, really important that whatever you apply can be applied in other settings also. So if you prove the efficacy in rugby, I want to prove it in soccer. But I can't prove it if I don't know what you did in rugby. The same thing, a perfect example would be the higher on a ladder of professional athletes you go. So we come to the elite athletes, the less time they have for such programs. So it's very important for us to know whether or not your program is 10 minutes long, 15 minutes long, or 35 minutes long. If your program shows great effectiveness, but it takes 35 minutes 3 times per week, we can't implement that in elite sports. We don't have 35 minutes only for neck strengthening. So, but it's important for us to know, right? We can all create this perfect setting in research that people come to our lab and we do this and this and this. But that means little if you can't apply that in a real world, right? So the same thing is here. If you don't tell us if it's 10-minute program, 20-minute program, or 30-minute program, we are not aware whether or not this can be replicated in our group. So that's a very simple example that I'm giving you now, but that type of information is really valuable for someone who wants to try this program and implement it in another setting. And I'll tell you that many of these aspects, like the motivational strategies, I think researchers don't really think about that, okay, this should be very valuable to provide if someone wants to replicate it. But it did not happen in most cases. Some papers really did a good job of reporting their programs, even showing the images and videos of the exercises they did. But we are talking about the minority here.
I can imagine. And I can promise you that most of the listeners to this podcast will be very happy because many of them have asked me to interview someone about the neck strengthening exercises, and I just found the right person. I learned much, much more than I thought that I would during this interview. I would like to thank you for that. Is there anything, to wrap this up, is there anything left that you think that this should have been asked, or this is something that you want to give to the listeners interested in concussion research and sports-related concussion prevention?
Again, I think that the most important point I would like to make here is that we need to be patient. I would also like to have all the data right now, right here. It would make me very, very happy to know what works and what it doesn't work. But also it's the research in sports-related concussion is really, really taxing, not only financially, but time-wise, dominantly. And I think that for every big study, like the Atwood study, like the Hislop study, where we see effectiveness that we want to see, we should be very grateful for those type of endeavors because they are very, very hard to produce. So I'm speaking for myself here, but I assume everyone who's interested in the prevention of sports-related concussion also, the name of the game is patience. And the name of the game is to put your head down and do your part, produce that little bit of a data that you are able to produce. And for the clinical practitioners to explore, to ask questions, to be daring in a way, because I know it's quite simple to smack a helmet on the head and say we're done with it. But that looks okay, and it's a very simple solution, but it's not applicable in every sport. It's not applicable in every population. And then also the data that shows us is also very questionable. So I think that we are still all of us are still looking. All of us are still exploring this topic. I think that this topic was so not important just like 10 years ago or 15 years ago, and now it's becoming really, really important, and it's been for a while now. So I'm very happy that the research is happening. I think that we just need to be a little bit more patient, give it some more time, and we're gonna find much more evidence in the upcoming years.
Thank you for that answer, Branimir, and thank you so much for participating in the Hjärnskakningspodden concussion podcast. I cannot say because maybe there's some other podcast with that name, but in Hjärnskakningspodden, thank you very, very much for your research and for talking us through this very complex and interesting subject. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Victor. And again, this is my research. I like to chat about it. If anyone is interested, feel free to reach out and we can have a cup of coffee, tea, or a beer, and we can go through it and just have a good time with it. That's completely fine by me.
Looking forward. Take care now.